Hello, good afternoon. That's loud. Hello, my name is Shannon, and I am a representative here from the Levitt Jewish Community Center. I'm the CXO, Chief Experience Officer, and we are thrilled to welcome y'all to the final Southern Jewish Voices of this season. We are so thankful to the Foundation and the Federation for the opportunity to put this on, so let's give them a round of applause. This has become such a wonderful program to offer to the community, and it is very fitting that, as I know him, Dr. Saag, Michael Saag, is closing out our program for the season. We're excited to come back in the fall. Thank you to Margaret for facilitating these wonderful conversations. Please check our website and YouTube page. We upload all of the episodes on there. You can see his amazing wife, Amy Saag, on there. So check back for this recording later if you want to review. And just thank you for being here. Enjoy the conversation.
Great. Thank you so much, Shannon, and thank you all for being here today for our last interview of the season. We're looking forward to being back in September. And I will say we have so much to get through today. Michael Saag has an amazing story, and Florina can attest we were on a plane to D.C. about 24 hours ago, and I was speed reading his book, which is really good. So I will say we're going to just kind of skim the surface today, and anything that we don't get to, I do encourage you to check out the book as well. We can plug that again at the end. But we are going to start how we always do, with it, which is just with some basic biography. So you were born in Louisville, Kentucky. This is where you were born and raised. And I would love to just start with you giving us a little background on where you grew up, what it was like to be a young Jewish person in Louisville growing up in the 1960s.
Well, thanks, and thanks everybody for being here. It's a little bit overwhelming. I was born in a log cabin off in the woods, and it was difficult.
This was not in the book.
Oh, I skipped that part. No, it was a typical mid-1950s baby boom era. My family, both generations, both sides, were 2 to 3 generations of Louisvillians, and you got to say Louisville proper, Louisville. And I just grew up there in elementary school, high school, and then went to Tulane undergrad after that.
Okay, we'll see if I can say Louisville by the end of this interview.
Yeah.
I'll try my best. I would love to pull out some of your family background and family anecdotes, though, and I did get some of this from your book. So your paternal great-grandfather came from Russia to the United States at the age of only 16, became a peddler, and ends up owning a candy store and then a successful sort of makeshift movie theater. And I also learned an interesting detail about the origins of your last name. So those are just a few of the sort of stories sprinkled in your book, and I would love if you could elaborate on them or share anything else about your family background you think is interesting.
So the reason I know so much about my paternal great-grandfather is that he wrote a memoir in 1938, 2 years before he died. It was really meaningful to me because I'm named after him. His name was Michael Swido. My name is Michael Swido Saag. So even though I was born 15 years after he died, that connection, I think, has a lot to say about who I am, both the good and the bad. He came to the United States. He lived in northern Ukraine, in what was then Russia, and there were pogroms going on, and he left before he got consigned to the army because he said, why do I want to fight for these guys? Marched across the border, ended up in Austria, and then wandered through Europe doing odd jobs, including coal mining and some other things, earned enough money, bought a ticket one way to Lower East Side of Manhattan, which was a cesspool back then. People think it's glorious. It's not. He spoke Yiddish. That's what got him by. He went to Yiddish theater. He then left and was a peddler. It's a very classic Southern Jewish story. Wandered around, ended up in St. Louis at one point and met his wife, Annie Tuval. And when he came here, when he got off the boat, they asked him what his name was. His original name was Switovsky, and they chopped off the Oski, and it was just Swido. Annie Tuval's family made confections, candies, and he learned how to do that. They got married. They ended up in Jeffersonville, Indiana, which is right across the river from Louisville. And he had spent some time at the Chicago World's Fair and saw what were in essence movies, and he thought that's pretty cool. So he started showing movies in his candy store at night to sell more candy. And he suddenly realized, well, wait a minute, I'm doing better with this, and ultimately built a series of movie houses, but had a very vertical business. He made his own candy, his own popcorn, so everything was internally done. Very shrewd, smart guy. And anyway, he wrote his memoirs, as I said, and my grandmother, Leela, his second daughter out of 5 children, said that half the stories in the book are true, we just don't know which half. And to me, I didn't give a damn. It was just a great story and very, very formal for me. Saag, my grandmother, Leela, married a guy named David Sagalowski, and she took a lesson from her dad and didn't like all that Olosky, so she chopped that off and was left with SAG. She didn't like the way that looked, and she wanted to be first in the phone book under the S's, so she shoved another A in there, and suddenly we're from Scandinavia.
I'd love for you to speak just a little bit more about the influence of your family's movie business on you, because movies and film really became a kind of lifelong passion.
Yeah, so one other quick fact about Michael Swito, Jewish-wise, Russian Jew. He founded the conservative shul in Louisville named Adith Shurin, and they named the chapel after him. And it remained the Michael Swito Chapel until they had a fundraiser, and they called some of our family and said, do you want to give? And we said, well, why should we give? He's the founder, and so they took another person's donation. There's no longer a Michael Swito Chapel there. No. But I have the sign. I've got it at home. That's pretty good. So the movie business, when I was growing up, there were 2 formative things for me. One, I would go with my dad to the drive-ins, and I would run the train when I was 8 years old and ride it around. And can you imagine an 8-year-old driving all these other people around? Somehow he didn't complain. But I would work during the movies and go in at the concession stand during intermission. But then it slowed down, so I'd go watch the movie. There was usually 3 per night, and I'd see them 6 times. So at age 9, 10, 11, I took myself through film school. So I would watch the movie like everybody else the first time, and then I'd watch it looking at why did they use a 4-second cut here as opposed to a 2-second, as opposed to a 6-second. Then I'd watch the same movie without sound. And I'll tell you that a horror movie with no sound is a comedy. Yeah, well, and you don't hear anything. The music, I would listen the next time to what the music did to enhance the story. And so out of that, I started making my own movies with a Super 8 camera, and it was a lot of fun. I was making music videos in 1967, 68, and but for medicine, I might have been doing MTV or something, but let that go. Or maybe, that's how Steven Spielberg started, but I didn't have the chutzpah to go to Hollywood. So anyway, that's how it had influence on me, and I still make movies even to this day.
Very neat. Maybe we'll touch on that towards the end. And we're going to spend a lot of time talking about career today, but I want to ask you one more growing up question, and this is sort of standard that I ask everyone, which is about how Judaism shaped your early life. And I did notice in your book, you describe your family as being Jewish in a way that was joyful and proud. And so I wonder if you can talk a little bit about why you use those words in particular.
Yeah, it was. We had 2 synagogues, either the conservative or the Reform. My mother was from a German Jewish family, so we went to the Reform. You all know this story very well from the 50s, 60s, 70s. Even we didn't have 2 country clubs, though, that had to merge. It was just one standard club, which is pretty standard for a lot of places. And but I would say that we had a lot of fun, especially on Pesach. We started off with the Haggadah, but then we would ad-lib and create our own stories, and that was encouraged somehow, and usually enhanced by the 7th glass of wine, which is a new thing if you don't know. And we would, my dad, whenever we go to synagogue, it was time to start, he goes, post time. because we're, in horse country, and that would always go. But one of the fun memories I have wasn't fun because my grandfather died, David Saag, but he went to shul, twice a day or at least once a day for the month after he died. And there were these two brothers, Klempner, who were in the scrap metal business. Some of you know the Klempners, I bet. And the Klempner's father had died at the same time. And there's the part of the service where you're davening and like this, and then you take 2 steps backwards, right? You'll know that part? Well, the Klempner boys would take 2 steps backwards and then leave. So I now know about the Klempner 2-step is what we called it. So that was part of the joyful part.
That's great. Okay, I'm going to take us from Louisville to Tulane, which is where you go to undergraduate. You go to study chemistry and you're pre-med. And I'd love you to talk about, when you knew that you were going to go into medicine. Did you know at that point for sure that that was the path in front of you?
When I was born, my mother said, "It's a boy, he'll be a doctor." There was never a choice. And Hal Abrams is here. He knew my mom very well, and he can attest that that's precisely what she would say. But I enjoyed medicine even as a kid. I was fascinated at the doctor's office. A friend of ours, a close friend of mine's father was a pediatrician. I spent a lot of time with him. But I will say this, is not many people would know this part, is that I went to Tulane for a couple reasons. One, because I had 2 older sisters, and I'm the youngest, so you can imagine I'm pretty spoiled and still am. And the older sisters went to college, and I realized, wow, that's a time of your life for 4 years where you're responsible only to yourself on somebody else's nickel. So I was going to make the most of that. So I looked around, all my friends were going to Indiana or someplace else, and I said, I want to get away from high school. I want to go to a place where I can have fun, and Tulane and being in New Orleans was a perfect place for me. I worked from 5 p.m. on Sunday till 3 p.m. Friday. It was all business, and then 3 p.m. Friday, school was out the window, and I just had a great time. One of the things I found most frustrating of being an undergrad is I wanted to go into movies. I wanted to make movies. I would have loved to have gone out to Hollywood. I would have loved to have been actually a lawyer. I like the concept of law. I don't like the practice maybe, but I would love to be a judge. I loved my dad's business. I could have done that. And so there's many other things, an actor even, if you can believe that. So I was frustrated early in freshman year because I realized that I couldn't do all the things I really wanted to do without giving something up. And so medicine ultimately ruled, but I was angry, frustrated that I couldn't do a lot of the other things. This later spilled into medical school because I saw these really talented people, very accomplished, lots of interest. And I felt like when they got to medical school, they got crushed. If you remember the movie Goldfinger, right? When Odd Job shoots a guy in the back of the Lincoln and then pulls the Lincoln into a lot and they put it through that crusher, and then they pick it up with a metal thing and drop it into a stack that, like all the other crushed cars. That's what I felt like medical school did to people. So my senior year, I was in charge of skit night. I don't know how that happened, but it's where we do lampoons and whatnot. And at the end of skit night, historically, what they would do is show a slideshow. After all the comedy, they would show a slideshow, usually to some ridiculously sappy music like The Way We Were. That drove me crazy. And I thought, well, I can do better than that. And I didn't want to make it all sentimental, so I wanted to make a movie. So I made a music video to the Beatles' A Day in the Life, which to me was 4 years of medical school. And, I read the news today, oh boy, about a lucky man who made the grade. And then woke up, fell out of bed, was the beginning of 3rd year, and it fit perfectly. That's actually on Vimeo. I can give you a link if you want to see it. But the take-home point was, the message I was trying to send was that we took these really, really interesting, accomplished, creative people and crushed them in medical school. And the final scene of the movie is this protagonist who you find going through it. It was Bruce Tash, if those of you from Louisville. He went through this whole thing, and then at the end, when they hit that final chord in the song, dum, you see him going in slow motion from into the medical school courtyard, his back to the camera, carrying a black bag and a white coat, slowly walking in, and then I changed the shot to above that and then go to the top of the building. So he's a little speck going off by himself into nowhere. And that to me was the comment about what 4 years of medical school did to people. So that was just those years of frustration that I couldn't make happen. So I fought, and I still fight, the tendency just to be crushed. I'm trying to do different things throughout my medical career.
Well, I was going to say, you mentioned that you still make films to this day, so it sounds like you just have, with that awareness, tried to hold on to those different parts of your life.
None of them got picked up for distribution, though.
You still have time.
Yeah, I do.
Well, let me ask you this, and maybe we can go back and cross-reference Amy's interview, but would love to hear any notes on how you all met, because that also happens when you're at Tulane.
All right, so fitting with this theme of being a whack job, we used to have these parties at the fraternity house. I was in ZBT there. And we had 160 some odd members. It wasn't very selective, but it was more like the more people you had in the fraternity, the more money that was there, and therefore the more parties you could have with better bands, and alcohol drinking age was 18, so you could get free booze and all that. So they have this thing called the Freshman Girls Party, and Amy and Gina Abrams was there, and they walked in with their friend Sherry Gordon, who's from Nashville. And I don't think Gina was with Amy at this exact moment, but you listen to the conversations of people, and they go, hey, where are you from? What's your major? God, that was awful. So I'm doing anything but that. So they walk in, and I say, I'm really distraught. I can't find my gold purse. Can you help me find my purse? So we spend 15 minutes running around the fraternity house looking for a gold purse. So that's how Amy and I met. And remarkably, she maybe found that interesting, but probably not anymore. But that's how we met.
That's great. Well, I'm going to keep moving us a little bit because we have so much to talk about as we get even deeper into your career. So after Tulane, you go back to Louisville. Maybe I'm saying it right, for medical school, and then to Birmingham, where you complete your residency and fellowship at UAB. And so I would love for you to start by talking about, initially you think you're going to be a cardiologist, and you're really drawn into the world of infectious diseases. So tell us about that transition and what happened.
So my mom wanted to be a surgeon like Norton Waterman, and I couldn't get up that early every day, so that was out. And so I got interested in cardiology because in medical school, for most students, that's the first thing you can actually understand that doesn't overwhelm you. There's a pump, there's flow, there's resistance, that's it, right? So it's easy. And I also figured the world needs another bald Jewish cardiologist, right? And I was going to be that guy. They just needed that. When I came to UAB, Amy keeps thinking I came here for her family. Don't tell her, but it was actually because it was the best program I applied to. And it just was a fortunate circumstance. So I ended up getting here, and I had a rotation in cardiology. Actually, Jack Levin was one of our patients, but we had an inpatient service on the wards, and we also covered the CCU. And that was a rotation in February of '82. Where there normally is a intern, resident, fellow attending. But for some reason, they didn't have a resident. So here I am, a first-year intern with a fellow and an attending covering 30-some-odd patients. And so I got more than my fill of cardiology, and that was good. I mean, I really enjoyed it. But as I started projecting, is this what I want to do the rest of my life? I said to myself, I like this, I don't love it. And it didn't matter what the history was, we're going to cath everybody anyway. So I said, I don't want to just cath and do that. So I got interested in infectious diseases because it was like being Sherlock Holmes. A strange constellation of things show up, and you got to dissect it and figure it out. And that was why I got interested in ID.
And just to clarify the timeline on this a little bit, because we're going to talk about, your long career treating patients with HIV/AIDS. You started your residency in 1981, which is the first year that the first cases of AIDS present themselves. Did you, at the time that you're going into infectious diseases, were you aware of that development already?
So about the day I graduated medical school was June 6, 1981 was when the first cases of AIDS were reported in the CDC's MMWR. Nothing to do with my decision, but that's just an interesting coincidence. So I started looking into ID. Now we're into 1982, into the summer. I'm a resident, second year, and the first case of AIDS shows up at UAB Hospital. And it was a guy from Huntsville who had histoplasmosis, for those of you who are physicians. And it was interesting, but I couldn't quite figure out what was going on. A big theme in the way I practice medicine is, it can be best summarized by Buffalo Springfield and the song For What It's Worth. The opening line being, there's something happening here, what it is ain't exactly clear. And that's the kind of case I'm most drawn to, because there's got to be an answer. The practice of medicine is simple but very difficult. The simplicity is it's common sense layered on a foundation of science. Straightforward, that's it. Nothing more to it. But the practice is much more complicated, as you know. So anytime something was not right, that could be with an individual patient I was seeing or with a phenomena like HIV, I was drawn to that just naturally. And that fit me more than cathing and doing cardiology.
And set a little bit of cultural context around this too. You're here for the first case of AIDS at UAB. There's a lot of uncertainty. Tell us a little bit about what the conversation was like at the time.
Yeah, so I'd love to tell you that I saw this and said, boy, I'm going to do that. It wasn't that simple. And I think none of our careers are planned very well. It's a lot of opportunity, serendipity, things happen. So for me, that was the case. I was intrigued somewhat, obviously, by the case, but there were so many other things. And then into my second year of residency, I got called to the principal's office, in essence, thought I did something wrong, but they asked me to serve a remedial year as a chief resident. And so I was going to go back home to be an ID doc in Louisville. I had Julio Melo, who those of you who know, he was like the top ID doc in practice there, said he had a place for me in his practice, and that's what I planned to do. But this year of being a chief introduced me to the world of academic medicine, which I didn't really know or that much care about. I'd done research undergrad, research in medical school, but that's like, doing somebody else's research. But I learned about academic medicine. A very influential person who Hal Abrams knew very well was Claude Bennett, an amazing human being, an amazing researcher, discovered the Dreyer-Bennett hypothesis, which I'll spare you the details, but big in immunology. And he wanted all of his chiefs to go into academic medicine, and he, behind the scenes, later I found out, was doing everything he could to set up dominoes for me to follow into academic medicine, one of which was during my serendipity, during my first day or two of fellowship, July of '85. I saw a patient in May of '85 that started testing the blood supply for HIV for the first time. Now, think about that. COVID, we had tests available a month after we didn't implement it well, but we had a test. AIDS was discovered in 1981. We didn't have a licensed test until May of '85. Wow. And we could go into days of conversation about why that is, but that's the way it was. And my first case in the ID clinic, and there were no attendings. They didn't deal with outpatient. They only cared about inpatient. So they send the fellows off to see the folks. And there's a woman, 34 years old, from Gadsden, school teacher, married, had 2 kids. The only sexual partner she ever had was her husband. I believed her. That's true. And she had gone to donate blood like she did every May. And in June, she got this rude letter from the Red Cross that said, your test was positive for this new thing called HTLV3, go see your doctor. She goes to the doctor in Gadsden who says, I don't know what to do, and sends her to the experts at UAB, me. First year fellow, don't know beans about this. So I'm listening to the story, and again, something happening here. What it is ain't clear. And about that time, George Shaw and Beatrice Hahn had moved to Birmingham from the NIH and Gallows lab. And they were in the NCI. They were a part of the discovery of HIV, and George was the first one to describe HIV in the brain, and Beatrice was the first one in the world to ever clone and sequence the virus. And they had worked with Al Labulio, who a lot of you know were big in the cancer center here, and George had worked with him for his PhD, and they recruited both of them here, and they had gotten there right at the same time that I started my fellowship. So I knew they were there. I took the story, called George up on the phone. He grilled me like I was some criminal. But it was 20 minutes of interrogation, I guess, sort of like we're working for Jerry Held, I guess. And so finally, after this long conversation, he tells me the tubes of blood. I feel like I hooked her up on wall suction and drew as much blood as I could, these tubes of blood, like maybe 25 of them, shoved them in my white coat and waddled down the hall to George's lab. Punchline is we discovered through a lot of stuff that she had a false positive HIV test. And that got me started working with George and Beatrice, and Claude behind the scenes saw this going on and said, George, you need to take him into your lab. So in January of '86, I started working in the lab. Sorry, I'm running with this, but I think it sets it up. I start the January 3rd of '86. He brings me a vial of DNA and teaches me how to do something called a southern blot, which is basically a genetic test. And it gives you a genetic fingerprint of a virus or the human genome or whatever you want. And he taught me how to do that for 10 days, and then he handed me this next vial that was a real experiment. The story was a guy who had been a bathhouse attendant in Los Angeles from 1979 to 1983. During the time that he worked there, he estimated that he had 1,500 different sexual partners. Right, everyone's going 1, 2, 1,500. And so the question scientifically was he super infected? Because we knew that each person's virus was genetically distinct and came from a common initial infection that evolved inside the person, think Darwin, over weeks instead of millennia. And so we asked the question, I ran the test, and when I got the sort of x-ray out, I looked at it and said, wow, he's got more than one virus. He's super infected. So I take it into George and go through another interrogation, and I leave that afternoon. There's a lot of things you can do to screw up this test, this southern blot. Come back the next morning, and George looks like he'd been up all night, because he was. And he repeated the experiment that I had done that day before. And now the x-ray's getting ready to come out of the thing, and I'm sweating bullets because I want to make sure that I didn't screw something up. And he has my x-ray result up there, and then his comes out, and he puts it up, and I went, holy shit, it's the same thing. So I didn't screw up. And what we discovered wasn't that he was super infected, but rather that he was infected with a single type of virus, that under the pressure of the immune system response, the virus escaped. So the HIV virus we know now it replicates in a normal situation without treatment 1 to 10 billion, with a B, viruses a day. Most of them are defective, but this is what's happening in someone who's got HIV before they get treated. The virus makes a mistake about every 9,000 base pairs, and so the virus itself is that. So every time the virus replicates, there's an error in transcription. Think about putting a Torah on paper. You try not to make a single error. This thing makes a mistake every 9,000 base pairs. So the natural history we learned was that as the virus replicates, a mistake is made, most often creating a dead virus. But the ones that are alive, under the pressure of the immune system, the previous virus is now being neutralized by the immune system, but this one escapes. And so you have this Tom and Jerry cat and mouse game where the mouse is the virus escaping all the time. And over time, you develop a swarm of viruses through that natural history that is truly Darwinian evolution on super steroids. And because you can get an entire species that emerges within months, over and over and over again. And when you take that snapshot like we did with the guy from the bathhouse, you're seeing, in essence, an archaeological dig of all the viruses that he had had before, and that's what hooked me into the lab. So from that point forward, I started working with George and Beatrice. Did I plan that? Hell no. I was just going there because Claude told me to work with George for 6 months. And that's the history.
Well, that is really interesting, and I think a good science lesson for many of us, and a good segue into talking about some of the ways in which you've been part of, caring for patients with HIV and even discovering some new methods of treatment.
Yeah, so to pick up the story, now I'm in my second year of fellowship. It's 1986. And this thing that we had discovered by late June of 86 had gotten a paper, a poster or whatever I presented at the second international conference on HIV in Paris. So here I am, a fellow, traveling to Paris, which is wacky. Made a movie there. I think, Hal, I know we showed it to you and Judy one night at our house. You may not remember, but I made it to an American in Paris as a music video. That's a sidebar. And this turned into 2 Nature papers, which, you can work your whole career in science and never get close. And here I am, still a fellow, and I've got 2 Nature papers. Not because of me, because I'm working with good people. And note to self, the best way to have success is to work with people a whole lot smarter than you. So I've made a career of that. By December of 86, this was well known, this discovery. So I get invited out as a fellow to San Francisco General Hospital, where the first HIV outpatient clinic in the world was founded by Paul Volberning in 1983. So I give grand rounds to these people at the Mecca, right, of AIDS. And that goes 8 to 9, and I have the rest of the day. So they set me up with 15 different people who worked at the HIV clinic there. And I just asked one question with a big, long legal pad. I said, if you guys were starting over, how would you design your clinic today? And just took copious notes, because by then we were seeing lots of people who had traveled home to die to Dothan or Huntsville or Birmingham or you name it. And the docs in the community appropriately didn't know anything about HIV, so they were sending them to us to do outpatient care, and that's a long way to go, and we didn't have a great place to see them. So I get back from that trip. It's now February of 87. I write this white paper that's about 30 pages long that made an assessment of what we're likely to see in terms of new cases of AIDS over the next 5 years. And it's exponential, as you might imagine. And it wasn't scientific. It just was literally a calculator doing some math. And I wrote this up, and I sent it to Claude Bennett, and I go to meet with them. So it's, maybe mid-February by now. I walk in, and Claude, I'm 3 minutes into my spiel. I feel like I have to really sell this thing. And he stopped me and said, this is great. You're coming on faculty. Here's your startup money. Here's your space. Start a clinic, and let me know if you have any trouble. This is in Birmingham, Alabama. I have friends in New York and in Boston and Chicago and LA who had none of that support because they were fighting. And here we are in a city that has this incredible civil rights history. And we at UAB were embracing, not just tolerating, we're embracing the notion of taking care of AIDS patients. Now your question is, did anybody object? There was one faculty member that I know of, and he was quickly squashed by Claude to not complain about this.
Can I ask you the opposite question, though, which is why do you think he gave the green light so quickly? Like, what was the...
He's a mensch. He was a mensch. He knew that was the right thing to do. He knew there was incredible science that we needed to discover. He knew there was an incredible need for compassionate care And there was nobody else in the division of ID because everybody was taking care of the usual stuff in ID. And here's this young guy coming in that has a clean slate and seems to have some interest in this and said, yep, you run with it.
It's amazing. Well, so tell us a little bit about the clinic beginning and how it's evolved over time and what does make it so distinct in terms of patient care.
So I took everything I learned from San Francisco and we set it up so that it had a 5-fold mission statement: patient care, of course, case management, because getting insurance and getting things paid for, research, which I'll come back to, community engagement. So there were entities like BAO and AIDS Alabama, which was something else at the time, and our job was to coordinate with the community to make this work. And then physician education specifically, so that docs in local locations 150 miles away would be able to communicate with us and take care of as much of this at home as without having them to trek to Birmingham. The research was really important, obviously. We set it up 3 ways. One is clinical trials, which everybody basically was doing in some form or fashion. But the unique thing that I picked up from San Francisco was to take every patient that we saw from day one as if they're on study. So I created charts that I could take home. I literally took them home and worked on a D-Base 4, those of you who remember, IBM computers. And every night, we only had 2 half days a week, but after every clinic session, I would enter their clinical information that I needed. And then, so I had basically a quasi-electronic health record in 1988, and specimens that were linked to the patient data. And that's what made it special, and that's what I learned from San Francisco. Everyone said, gosh, I wish we had a database. Gosh, I wish we had specimens. So we had it from day one.
Wow. Well, as predicted, I have many more questions than I have time left, so I might jump around a little bit here. One thing that I really want to ask you about, because it's such a theme in your work, is, you've had this long career working in the American medical system. What have you seen in our healthcare system that presents particular challenges for the patients that you care for, that you've identified as major issues?
Our healthcare system sucks. I don't have to convince you of that. You live it every day. To say that we have health insurance is stupid. Insurance is something you get when, for a rare event, your house burns down, you have a car accident, you die prematurely. Healthcare, everybody needs every day. Why is that insurance? That's a service. It's not insurance. And we've never gotten that straight. And I recognize that even, I think, in high school, but all throughout my career, I've fought trying to get us to convert from an insurance concept to a service concept, and I still haven't gotten anywhere. So the book that I wrote was really a rant because I was so frustrated. And I said to my friend in New York when I was ranting in 2010, he said, you should write a book. I said, nobody wants to read a rant. That's a blog, and you can only put up with a page and a half. He said, no, couch it in a story. So I said, you mean like a memoir? And he said, yeah. He was thinking fiction, but he said, yeah, that'll work, because I flashed to Michael Swido. And I said, damn, I've always known I wanted to write a memoir, not to publish to the public, but just for the family, just like he did. I said, okay, so the book has got 3 threads. It's me, sadly, so you got to put up with that. It's a story of AIDS, how it went from a death sentence to a chronic manageable condition, with a lot of the stories I've already shared, but many more. And then a rant that's all woven in the book throughout. And the solution, you're going to say, what do I think is best? I don't have a great one, except that it needs to be a service. It needs to be something we all pay into. It needs to be uniform, because the chaos that's in our service costs us at least 35 cents per dollar. And if you go to the VA, for example, the overhead cost is maybe 5 cents on the dollar. So the confusion, the chaos is what really drives our costs up. A theme in the book on that rant, and I'll stop at this point on that, is to say that if you take the 17 industrialized countries in the world and you look at health outcomes, The United States is in the last 2 or 3 of every metric. Think of it, every metric as a population, except for 2. If you're a woman and you make it to age 90, we're number 1 from that point. So God bless you. And the second is cost. For all these worth outcomes, it is at least twice as expensive in the United States as any other country on earth. And that's what the book's about.
So read more in the book, but definitely some important insights. And one other subject I want to touch on before we move into some closing questions is when I was doing my Google research, I ended up reading some of your reflections on COVID. You actually got COVID very early on in the pandemic and then wrote about it from your standpoint as an infectious disease expert. So I would love if you could talk just a little bit about what that experience was like, why you feel compelled to share your story. And, I noticed in one article you wrote, you talked about the need to be more prepared for the next inevitable pandemic. And I wonder what advice you would give to all of us.
So basically, the lessons I learned from patients in the 80s, I learned that those who were brave enough to step forward and tell their story despite the stigma, the ones who made the most dent in stigma. Those who talked about what it was like. Kathy Friedman knows most of these people. And they were public. Billy Cox, there's dozens, I could give you their names. And they made a difference. So this COVID thing felt a lot like the early days of AIDS, except it was compressed. It didn't happen over the course of 5 to 7 years. It was happening over 5 weeks. So I didn't plan to get infected, but I was sitting at home, and our son Harry and I drove back from New York. At his hospital in mid-March, when we drove back together at NYU, they had 690 beds, 680 had COVID patients. So he's taking care of boatloads of people. Inadvertently, not known to me or him, he was infected. We're in a car ride with the windows up for 18 hours or 16 hours. So if you want to create a recipe for transmission of COVID, there it is. We pull in the driveway on a Friday night. It was Friday the 13th in March. And he says, I don't feel good. Uh-oh. He's got fever. So I figured, I've got it too, I'm sure. Next morning or next day, I have fever. He gets well quickly. Good for him as a 30-something. I wasn't quite so fortunate. And so what I thought was important from the lessons I learned when you have a mysterious ailment like HIV or COVID, tell the story. So I was reporting partly as a patient and partly as a doctor. And I wrote op-eds in the Washington Post. And the best way I can describe the feeling, what I was having was I felt great in the morning, or reasonably okay. Thought I was over it. 5 o'clock p.m., I get a cytokine storm, which makes you basically feel like shit, like you got hit by a bus. You've all had this if you had the flu. And then by 10, 11 o'clock p.m., I would be almost incapacitated. And the only thing that kept me going was binge watching Ozark. So I saw all 4 seasons at once. It would fit my mood. It was perfect. And I would be up till 2 in the morning with shaking chills, and I kept checking my pulse ox, which you want it to be 90 or above, and it would dip down to 89, which you're supposed to go to the hospital, and I would just change fingers, And by the next morning, it would be better. So I figured, all right, I've dodged that bullet. And that went on for like Passover. It went on for 8 days and 8 nights, or Hanukkah, whichever you want to say. And finally, the Maccabees arrived, and I was freed and moved forward.
Wow. And I know we've skipped around quite a bit, so before I move us into our kind of personal closing questions, is there any part of your career that you feel like we haven't touched on that you really want to highlight in the time we have left?
No, I think we got through most of it. I think one thing that I'm particularly proud of, and it goes back to the specimen repository, in June 1992, probably around the first or second week, I'm at my desk, and I get Thursday afternoon. I get a call from a guy named Jeff Lifson, who's in Redwood City, California, working for a company called Gene Labs. And he says, I hear you have a database and specimens. I said, yeah. He goes, well, we've got a test that we think we can quantify the amount of virus in the bloodstream. Remember, work with people who are smarter than you. So he's describing this test, because the problem was we had PCR, but it was so sensitive that you couldn't quantify the amount of virus. It was too wildly inconsistent. But he had figured out a way to quantify it. I can go into details later. But he describes this process to me, and I've literally got a paper towel and a pencil. And I'm writing this process down. I go, damn, I think this is going to work. He said, can you send me specimens? I said, absolutely. I race down the hall to the repository freezers. I don't even have to look up the patients because I know them. And I know the repository number. And I select 85 specimens, plasma. And they were several from acute seroconversion, several from what we used to call asymptomatic, several from something called ARC, several from advanced disease, and 7 or 6 negative controls. Mixed them all up, labeled them 1 through 85, put them on dry ice, sent them out to Redwood City. 4 weeks later, I get a phone call. He says, check your fax machine. Remember that? And I said, okay. Meanwhile, I prepare a graph paper. Remember this from high school, logarithmic graph, log versus whatever. And I labeled them all these different categories, and he sends me the thing, and I'm breaking the code. And all the people that were not infected had no detection. All the people who had acute seroconversion didn't have positivity. They had millions of copies per milliliter of plasma. The ones who with advanced AIDS, 100,000 to 500,000. The ones who were asymptomatic, maybe just 1,000 to 10,000. And the other ones were somewhere in between. And I dropped the pencil and said, holy shit. My God, it's almost like I made this up. And that's how the use of viral load was discovered. And it wasn't because I did it. I just got the specimens and sent it. Work with people smarter than you. And we now use viral load every day in practice.
Wow. Well, two closing questions for us, and these are both things that we've touched on a little bit, but I want to bring us back to in the end. One is we talked about the role of Judaism in your early life, but tell us a little bit about the role of Judaism in your life today and maybe how it's changed over time or not.
Well, I think Amy's the biggest influence, so she's the one who gets me to synagogue often, and I always use the Klempner two-step, but she brings me back in. But I think Judaism it's like most any good religion. It's not unique in a way. It's a religion that gives us the grounding for living good lives and treating other people the right way. And so I think we all do that. And in the practice of medicine, it's more than just treat everyone like you want to be treated. It's understand who they are as human beings, meet them where they are, and provide the service that you've been hired to do. And that came from Judaism.
And then I always like to end on something light, and you told me that you are semi-retired. I'm not entirely sure what that means. You can elaborate. But what are you doing for fun with your extra time, whether that's family, film? Tell us a little bit about that.
So Amy calls me a rhino, and that's retired in name only, not a Republican anymore. So I'm a rhino. I play golf poorly, as a lot of people in the room can attest, but I'm trying to get better. It didn't work so well last Sunday. In fact, it was pretty horrible. But I stick at that. I'm reading books a little bit more. I'm still working. Like I have clinic this afternoon that's starting right now, but it's okay if I'm a little bit late. I have 2 half-day clinics. I still round with house staff because they're a captive audience and they have to laugh at my jokes, and that's empowering to me. So I do that 3 2-week blocks a year on general medicine even. Still do general medicine. I'm still involved with a lot of national organizations, serving on boards for medical education and some other things. I'm basically doing everything I want to do and nothing that I don't want to do, and that's the best time of life. It's like being back in college, except I'm on my own nickel instead of my dad's nickel.
Well, that sounds pretty good. And I guess last question is, where can people find your book if they want to read more?
Well, actually, this sounds wacky. You can buy it if you want, but if you just want it, just email me. I'll send you a copy. I mean, the proceeds from this go to a research fund, but this isn't about making money. Now, I did set it up so that I own the copyright. So that way, if anybody ever wants to make a movie, I get those rights, and that's where I'll make money.
Very nice. Well, thank you so much for being with us today. We can give a round of applause.
We finished on time. Yay.
Yes, we always do, and we'll see you all back here in September.